September 11, 2001, 19 men armed with box cutters directed by a man on dialysis in a cave fortress halfway around the world using a satellite phone and a laptop directed the most sophisticated penetration of the most heavily defended airspace in the world, overpowering the passengers and the military combat-trained pilots on 4 commercial aircraft before flying those planes wildly off course for over an hour without being molested by a single fighter interceptor. These 19 hijackers, devout religious fundamentalists who like to drink alcohol, snort cocaine, and live with pink-haired strippers, managed to knock down 3 buildings with 2 planes in New York, while in Washington a pilot who couldn't handle a single-engine Cessna was able to fly a 757 in an 8,000-foot descending 270-degree corkscrew turn to come exactly level with the ground, hitting the Pentagon in the budget analyst office where DoD staffers were working on the mystery of the $2.3 trillion that Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld had announced missing from the Pentagon's coffers in a press conference the day before, on September 10th, 2001. Luckily, the news anchors knew who did it within minutes.
Osama bin Laden.
The pundits knew within hours.
Osama bin Laden.
The administration knew within the day.
Terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
And the evidence literally fell into the FBI's lap.
That a hijacker's passport was found blocks from the World Trade Center crash site, if you can believe that.
But for some reason, a bunch of crazy conspiracy theorists demanded an investigation into the greatest attack on American soil in history. That investigation was delayed, underfunded, set up to fail, a conflict of interest, and a cover-up from start to finish. It was based on testimony extracted through torture, the records of which were destroyed. It failed to mention the existence of WTC-7, Able Danger, P-TECH, Sibel Edmonds, OBL and the CIA, and the drills of hijacked aircraft being flown into buildings that were being simulated at the precise same time that those events were actually happening. It was lied to by the Pentagon, the CIA, the Bush administration, and as for Bush and Cheney, well, no one knows what they told it because they testified in secret, off the record, not under oath, and behind closed doors. It didn't bother to look at who funded the attacks because that question is ultimately of little practical significance. Still, the 9/11 Commission did brilliantly answering all of the questions the public had, except most of the victims' family members' questions, and pinned blame on all the people responsible, although no one so much as lost their job, determining the attacks were
failure of imagination.
Because
Nobody in our government, at least, and I don't think the prior government that could envision flying airplanes into buildings.
Except the Pentagon, FEMA, NORAD, and the NRO. The DIA destroyed 2.5 terabytes of data on Able Danger, but that's okay because it probably wasn't important. The SEC destroyed their records on the investigation into the insider trading before the attacks, but that's okay because destroying the records of the largest investigation in SEC history is just part of routine record keeping. NIST has classified the data that they used for their model of WTC-7's collapse, but that's okay because knowing how they made their model of the collapse would jeopardize public safety. The FBI has argued that all material related to their investigation of 9/11 should be kept secret from the public, but that's okay because the FBI probably has nothing to hide. This man never existed, nor is anything he had to say worthy of your attention, and if you say otherwise, you are a paranoid conspiracy theorist and deserve to be shunned by all of humanity. Likewise him, and her. And her, and her, and him. Osama bin Laden lived in a cave fortress in the hills of Afghanistan, but somehow got away. Then he was hiding out in Tora Bora, but somehow got away. Then he lived in Abbottabad for years, taunting the most comprehensive intelligence dragnet employing the most sophisticated technology in the history of the world for a decade, releasing video after video with complete impunity and getting younger and younger as he did so, before finally being found in a daring SEAL team raid which wasn't recorded on video, in which he didn't resist or use his wife as a human shield, and in which these crack special forces operatives panicked and killed this unarmed man, supposedly the best source of intelligence about those dastardly terrorists on the entire planet. Then they dumped his body in the ocean before telling anyone about it. Then a couple dozen of that team's members died in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan. This is the story of 9/11, brought to you by the media which told you the hard truths about
his head could be seen to move violently forward.
And
they took the babies out of incubators.
And
mobile production facilities.
And
the rescue of Jessica Lynch.
If you have any questions about this story, you are a batshit paranoid tinfoil dog-abusing baby hater and will be reviled by everyone. If you love your country and or freedom, happiness, rainbows, rock and roll, puppy dogs, apple pie, and your grandma, you will never ever express doubts about any part of this story to anyone. Ever. This has been a public service announcement by the Friends of the FBI, CIA, NSA, DIA, SEC, NSM, White House, NIST, and the 9/11 Commission. Because ignorance is strength.
Hey, Inspire Tribe, my fellow freedom lovers. It's John Nolan here. Thank you so much for tuning in. It is, what is it, Tuesday? It's Tuesday, September 9th, 2025. We're going out of the matrix into prime reality and talk about a day that happened almost a quarter century ago, 24 years ago, 9/11, September 11th, 2001. The day they literally changed the matrix in a way that recent history really doesn't give us an example for. Very profound, very deep, and here we are 24 years later. Guess what? No one responsible for that day has been held accountable, and I say that with sincerity. Everything else is just propaganda and psyops. However, that doesn't mean that justice hasn't been served on other levels, and I don't think we have seen the greatest impact of 9/11 yet. I think that's still to come. But today, I would like to remind everyone that what happened on that day, I believe it was a Tuesday as well, right? What happened on that day shifted so much, and especially in hindsight, that we can't ever overestimate the impact that it had on the human psyche, on the human spirit, but actually where most people forget about it, on the awakening. Nothing did it as fast and as impactful as 9/11 did. And people to this day will tell me that's the one thing that opened my eyes, and you could never convince me otherwise. After I've seen evidence after evidence, coincidence after coincidence, lie after lie, deception after deception, that's the one that showed me just how deep and how big this whole thing could potentially be. So I like to every now and then, at least once a year, go over it. What I'm curiously observing is that veterans of the alternative media, those who are, have been here for a while, are revisiting this subject often during the year, not just on the anniversary, and are not letting it go, which I think is highly important, because I think this one is still going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak. So let's look a little bit at the most strange coincidences of that day, and we can't possibly fit them all in one show. I have thousands of hours of research in 9/11, like many of you, a lot of it, and all I can tell you is, to this day, none of the things that we were told are true. None of them, not a single thing was true. And the truth is obviously so much deeper. So let's look at a few months before 9/11. Most of you know that Alex Jones famously predicted it, but so did Bill Cooper. Let's look at this little clip here together and what he said in June of 2001.
Whatever is going to happen, blame on Osama bin Laden, don't you even believe it. Another social engineering project to change the minds and the attitudes and the beliefs of the people of the world, and especially the United States, to bring about one world socialist totalitarian government. I wonder what Osama bin Laden's targets are supposed to be. And if they don't, if this doesn't materialize in the next 2 or 3 weeks, it will eventually materialize, because they haven't succeeded in taking our freedoms away. In fact, there's been a great awakening in this country that is gaining momentum. And so I can tell you with a certainty, they must do something terrible in order to stop this backlash and regain the sympathy of the mass herds of sheeple out there.
Boy, was he on point, wasn't he? They must do something big, something terrible. Well, a few months prior to 9/11, the notorious report was issued by an organization called the Project for a New American Century, one of those Washington, D.C. think tanks that was run and organized by some of the highest officials in the Bush administration to come at that point. It was still the year 2000, and they had released this Project for a New American Century report. And in that report, they talked about how America was going to, re-emphasize its leadership in the world, and all the countries that they needed to go to, basically calling for wars in those countries: Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Yemen, Jordan, I believe, were the 7. Well, look at the look at the last 24 years and what has happened. But basically, they outlined why these countries are of such strategic importance and why America and an alliance needed to go in there. They also said that such actions would be highly unlikely to be supported by the public unless there was another catalyst event like another Pearl Harbor. Literally, that's what they called it. Well, what was 9/11 likened to so many times? Another Pearl Harbor. And it created the greatest wave of support for the military, support for war, probably since World War II, since Pearl Harbor. So that happened a few months prior. And then, you had, obviously, because even it doesn't matter who plans such a thing like 9/11, and we obviously know it wasn't the people that they said that planned it, but no matter who plans it, you can't plan such an event without chatter. Chatter meaning there is some sort of information drops in the sphere that are going to get picked up by intelligence communities around the world. That's going to happen because it's too big to not leave any crumbs. And so the signals were picked up by multiple intelligence agencies around the world, including America's. And that was conveyed to the administration, but they didn't want an official beginning of the clock ticking, meaning they didn't want to officially acknowledge that information. Well, why? Well, you be the judge. I'm not going to point fingers here today. I'm just going to point out the incredible coincidences of that day. And I want to start, before we go into the list here, with the video that for me still to this day is one of the most memorable one. And it's because of the language that was used that totally gives it away. So it's of a guy called Mark Walsh. You might have seen it. He was a Fox contributor at the time, and he gave a soundbite on 9/11 that was so conveniently worded because he used the language that the official story was going to use from that day forward, right? So let's look at this here. Always an eye-opener.
We want to bring in Mark Walsh, who's a freelancer for Fox. You live just a few blocks away, and you watch the planes hit the towers.
I was watching with my roommate. It was approximately several minutes after the first plane had hit. I saw this plane come out of nowhere and just ream right into the...
By the way, and I'm going to rewind here a little bit. Notice the guy in the background? The MIB looking kind of guy, that was the handler making sure, this is just my interpretation, the handler making sure things were set the right way. So let's rewind a little bit.
The first plane had hit. I saw this plane come out of nowhere and just ream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
Well, I mean, just as rehearsed, Mark Walsh, great job, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense. He clearly knew that from watching from his apartment. He clearly knew that had to have been the cause, because that's what everybody thinks. It's structural failure because the fire was too intense. You don't think of bombs. You don't think of the plane. You just worded exactly like the 9/11 Commission report would later word it as well. Interestingly enough, this guy totally gave it away. What a scripted event. And it is much easier for us to see now, after all the revelations that have come out since about the Mockingbird media, about the Smith-Mundt Act that was repealed, about just how planted stories are and how the media is an apparatus, nothing to do with news or current events, but it is a make-believe. It's another section of PSYOP, psychological operations. So now let's look at maybe one more report that came out after 9/11 and that was buried and found again and buried and found again and buried and found again. Maybe it was even planted. We don't know, but very interesting. Let's watch this together.
In the days after the September attacks, there were countless rumors about strange coincidences surrounding the events. One report about a group of Middle Eastern men spotted the morning of September 11th parked just across the river from New York City has not gone away. Investigation of their presence has led to questions about whether Israel was conducting espionage on U.S. soil. We're joined now by ABC's John Miller with an exclusive report this evening.
That's right, Elizabeth. This is a case that took the FBI and the CIA more than 2 months to sort out, while 5 Israelis waited in jail. It began when this woman was watching the Twin Towers burning from her apartment in New Jersey. She noticed 3 men on top of a van, posing for pictures with the towers burning in the background.
And I could see that they were like happy. You know, they didn't look shocked to me. You know, they didn't look shocked. I thought it was very strange.
The witness called police, who stopped the van hours later and arrested 5 men. All 5, it turns out, were Israeli. They were turned over to the FBI. Sources tell ABC News during a check of national security databases, some of the men were listed as having had connections with Israeli intelligence. At the FBI, that set off alarm bells. The FBI needed the answers to 3 important questions. Who were these men? What brought them to that parking lot on the morning of September 11th? And did they have any advance knowledge of what was going to happen that day? The men said they were just taking pictures at the time. They said they worked for a company called Urban Moving. The FBI obtained a search warrant for the company's offices.
2 SUVs were filled up with between 9 and 12 boxes and computers.
Not long after the arrests, the offices of Urban Moving were simply abandoned. Almost everything was left behind. In jail, the 5 Israelis were repeatedly interrogated and given lie detector tests. Stephen Gordon was their American lawyer.
They were asked questions if they had ever been approached by or hired by any non-United States intelligence community.
Sorry, this is the kind of news report that you don't find anymore. These are being banned, if you will, buried. And today, this is not really discussed any longer, except for those who remember that it happened, or that at least that it was reported on, right? So very interesting. And you could then go and ask the question, who wrote a book in 1995 and wrote in that book that if America doesn't wake up to militant Islam and the dangers of it, then the next thing that militant Islam was going to do is bring down the World Trade Center. It's a question. Who wrote that book? Go find it out. Interesting. Very prominent figure today. Very, very present in today's media. The guy who wrote that book. Go look it up. But let's look at some of the interesting coincidences of that day, in addition to what we just saw. Most people don't know this, but even though the administration at that time claimed, including the President Bush at that time claimed, that such scenarios could simply not be envisioned, NORAD, which is responsible for the response of protecting the airspace in America, was conducting drills on that very day about hijacking planes and flying them into buildings. So that was happening simultaneously to supposedly the real thing. The response time of the air defense on that day was much, much longer than usually within 20 minutes. Anywhere in the United States, if there's a hijacking, there's going to be a fighter jet there, 20 minutes tops. It took over an hour on 9/11. We know that, right? And then at the same time, there was confusion, because when you have a drill and then you have the real life event, it's hard to really distinguish between what's real and what isn't in such a scenario. Obviously, we've seen this strange coincidence pattern over and over again where remember the Boston Marathon bombing, you had a drill practicing the same thing simultaneously. Over and over, we see drills either close to the event or on the day of the event. So that was a very, very strange one. Just a coincidence, folks. Then, you might remember Larry Silverstein, the lease. I mean, he's referred to as the owner, but he really took over the lease of 9/11 in July of 2001, and the building was insured for multi-billion dollars, even though it was considered, even at that time, to be worth much, much less. And he got a payout of $4.5 billion. Very interesting story, but this is not the biggest coincidence. Guess what? Larry Silverstein has always prided himself and said in interviews that he has the same routine. He gets breakfast at the World Trade Center. He meets there in the morning. He's there. His kids are there. They work there. But guess who wasn't there that day? Yeah, guess what? Good old Larry accompanied his wife to a dermatologist's appointment that morning, because nothing is more common for New York City moguls and real estate moguls than to accompany their wives to a dermatologist's appointment. This is a common trait, they're just perfect husbands. So what a coincidence for Larry, and the kids probably went along too, just to hold mom's hand. I'm sure that's what happened. Then we have the infamous Bush classroom scene. This one is to this day, there's so much to unpack here. And I'm really sharing this for everyone who didn't do all the deep dives. So George Bush is in Florida that day. Florida is a great state for George Bush, and we're going to get to that. But he's in Florida that day, and he's in a classroom of an elementary school. He had allegedly already been informed about the first plane. There was a story that surfaced where George Bush said he watched the first plane hit the tower, and he thought to himself, boy, that's a terrible pilot. Well, how would he have watched the first plane hit the tower when there was no video of that at the time when he was there? Because that only surfaced much, much later. Video. So that was a confusing story that they kind of tried to do away with because it was so confusing. Because he said before he went into the classroom, he was watching a TV screen and there was the first plane hitting a tower. Well, that wasn't available at the time. So whatever he was watching, and I don't remember, but 2001, how many TV screens were there in elementary schools where you could actually watch it? It's not like you're in a bar, but hey. So then he sits in a classroom and the kids do the spelling bee thing, right? And guess what words they were spelling for George Bush? Kite, hit, steal, plane, must. So hit, steal, and plane being three key words of 9/11 out of the 5 that they spelled. Just another big coincidence. Then the guy walks in and whispers into the president's ear and says, hey, there was a second plane that hit the second tower, at which point it is absolutely clear beyond the shadow of a doubt that this is a deliberate event. It's not an accident. Now, 2 planes hitting 2 towers in New York City, I would say, would warrant the Secret Service to storm into the classroom, get the president the hell out, and put him in a safe spot. I think that would be standard protocol, whichever way you slice it, right? But well, they didn't do that. He sat there for another 7 minutes before then they, walked out. And then guess who did not take over that day and ran all the response? Well, the president didn't, but his vice president, Mr. Evil himself, Dick Cheney, actually was the guy in charge who took over and basically ran the whole show. So, just another coincidence. Well, what happened a few days before 9/11, you might remember this. Some people with psychic powers on Wall Street, they put options on American Airlines, on United Airlines, and on businesses that were located in the World Trade Center. Boy, I mean, they were on point. How do you make that connection? Let's say you bet randomly against 2 airlines, randomly the 2 airlines involved in the supposed crashes or attacks. But then you also have the foresight to bet against businesses that are in the World Trade Center and make a shit ton of money. Well, that did happen. It was never investigated. Nobody ever really got charged for that, and it was just, a random coincidence of 9/11. Well, then we have, of course, the infamous Building 7, the Solomon Building, which, wow, that one just is amazing. That one probably fell out of sympathy for the others. It just wanted to, because the two towers fell in the first time in history that steel towers collapsed because of fire. Now we know that fire doesn't melt steel. The temperature, or jet fuel doesn't melt steel. It just doesn't burn hot enough. But that happened. And then Building 7 collapses, perfectly collapses, doesn't tip over. No, it collapses perfectly, just like a controlled demolition. And on top of that, the BBC and then CNN reported on it before it happened. Again, another amazing foresight. They're just full of psychics over there. And then Larry Silverstein goes on and says on PBS a year later, there was such tragic loss of life that day, we just decided to pull it. Okay, so anyone who has ever had anything to do with demolition or has even been close to a demolition building knows that pulling it means to have a controlled demolition. That's what pulling it means. It's just like all the other Bush officials that over the years slipped on live TV and said, oh, when we shot down the planes. Oh, no, I mean, when the plane crashed or stuff like that. That happened frequently. But Building 7 is the biggest red flag of that day. If there's anyone out there who hears about Building 7 and still even remotely believes the official story, they are such a hopeless case of such a moron that there's absolutely no sense in talking to them any longer. Building 7 is the single biggest piece of evidence that this wasn't at all what was said. Now, what's also interesting is that so many ongoing cases, the Enron case, the $2.3 trillion missing from the defense budget, that went missing, and many other fraud investigations that were going on at the time. All those records were kept either in Building 7, in the World Trade Center buildings, or at the Pentagon. So all the evidence destroyed because, clearly there were only paper files in 2001. All the evidence destroyed, and most of these cases went away afterwards. Well, that is convenient, but it's just a coincidence. What do we have here? Oh, I don't know why this slide is brighter than the others, but hey, that's the Pentagon. Okay, so I'm going to leave it here for a moment. Let me take this off. This is blinding. So the Pentagon. Supposedly, a plane, a commercial airliner, flies over the interstate, then hits multiple, those big light poles that they have on the interstate, and everything hits all of that perfectly. They just pop over like somebody had popped them out, and then hits the Pentagon, which is not a very high building. It's not a tall building. It's a fairly low building, perfectly, exactly in the area of the Pentagon that's getting remodeled. Very few people, but although it's getting remodeled, that's where all the evidence is for the ongoing investigation. So that's where that plane hits, right? Now, within minutes of that hit, there's tens of agents all over the area, actually all over the city, probably more, that confiscate every single videotape from every hotel, from every roof, from every building, from everywhere. So there are no angles ever to be seen from that attack into the Pentagon. Years later, some of the worst security video footage that you've ever seen is released to the public, missing multiple frames. And still you could see that it wasn't a plane, but that at best it was a missile. It was something like that, but it was not a plane. The lawn is perfect. The the impact site of the Pentagon is way too small for a plane. Also, the wings I guess they just randomly broke off before it hit. So all of these things happened, right? And you go, okay, so we haven't even talked about the improbability of planes having actually hit the Twin Towers. To this day, I think it's highly unlikely that planes actually hit the Twin Towers. Most likely, and we're going to get into those speculative things that I found over the years, most likely something else happened there. But okay, let's move on from the official coincidences. Then we have Shanksville. So Pennsylvania, that was the infamous story of the let's go, where we had recordings from the cockpit. I believe it was the only black box ever found. The others were never found or destroyed or couldn't be used. But here we have clear recordings from on board, from back. Black boxes usually do not record outside of the cockpit, but hey, okay, I might be wrong on that. So we have this whole hero story of how they overpowered the hijackers and they brought the plane down, right? However, where's the plane? Let me blow up this footage for you. This is interesting, right? When you bring down a plane, you might hope that there is actually a plane, but there's no plane. There's just a big ass hole in the field there. And then the coroner, infamously said, I stopped being a coroner because there were no bodies. So yeah, when a plane crashes into the ground, the plane does not disappear. It doesn't just dissolve. And bodies don't just get pulverized. But they did on that particular day. And it was turned into this hero story. Of course, we haven't even talked about the phone calls, right? Phone calls made from the planes that were technically impossible at that time. They're possible today. They weren't possible back then, especially not with that clarity. Yeah, guys that called their mothers and introduced themselves with their full names. Because clearly, every time I call my mom, I give her my full name just to be sure she knows who's calling, right? It's what everyone does. What else do we have on this list here? Oh, let's look at this here. Unusual security events. Well, George Bush's brothers, they sure always were of great help to him. Here's Marvin Bush, who was a director, was on the board of directors, I should say, for a company that was called Securicom, was later renamed conveniently into Stratesec or Stratesec. And he was on a board of directors, and that was the company that was responsible for the security for the World Trade Center. Well, interestingly enough, they had multiple failure events and complete power outages in the days and weeks and even months leading up to 9/11, and strange workings inside. Now, we know that there were art student projects inside those buildings, and people had incredibly lenient clearances where they could go into all kinds of places in the buildings where usually only maintenance staff goes and that are secured for a reason. And far be it from me to suggest that, explosives were planted, additional ones. Now, usually when such big buildings are built, believe it or not, sometimes explosives are already built when the building is built, just so they can later, pull it when they need to. This, of course, were different kind of explosives, a different kind of technology, a very hot burning technology that cuts through the steel beams. But yeah, so George Bush's brother Marvin was on the board of directors. You know why this is interesting? Because a year prior, another brother of George Bush's would be very helpful to him. It is when the first presidential election happened with Gore and Bush. Remember, there was a tie. And guess which one was the tie-breaking state? It was Florida. Well, who was the governor of Florida at that time? Where was Jeb Bush, George Bush's brother? And was heavily involved basically in stopping the recount. The margin was so small that, between Gore and Bush, and they had already called Florida for Al Gore. And then Karl Rove, the Republican mastermind came in, gave a call to everybody. No, no, no. Jeb Bush got involved. Well, in December, it was then officially declared that Bush won and the whole thing was over. And Al Gore became the billionaire climate czar. So, it was a win-win, I guess. But yeah, coincidentally, was part of, leading part of the security company that went bust a year later, by the way. So when they didn't use it and need it anymore, it went bust in 2002. The controlled demolition evidence, I already hinted at that. Eyewitnesses, firefighters, journalists, everybody who was on the ground, including video evidence that we have from the firefighters, because they were shooting a documentary, remember, around those days. They would walk into the lobby and see that, that was after the plane hit. They walked into the lobby. You see video evidence, all the windows, everything is shot, everything is destroyed, like there had already been bombs that were deployed. And they said that the plane that hit on top of the building destroyed the windows in the lobby, but it didn't destroy the windows in between, which makes total sense, clearly. You could also hear booms on video. You could hear bombs exploding. Everybody that was in the buildings between the whatever hit them and they collapsed said that there were bombs that went off, and they know it. But yeah, just another strange coincidence. Just like no steel frame building had ever collapsed due to fire until 9/11. But I guess there's just a first time for everything. What you see here in these images, in those yellow circles, you don't see those things. They're actually not there. So these clear signs of bombs going off to facilitate the, perfect collapse, just like a demolition. Those things didn't happen, and they weren't there, and we're all imagining this. Then this is one of those where I think the strategists got together and said, let's put some things in there that are so ludicrous just to make fun of the public, just to see how gullible the sheeple could be. Well, we had passports recovered, right, from the crash site in Pennsylvania. That's Shanksville. That's the one where the plane got pulverized. We don't see the plane. The coroner doesn't see bodies, but the passport survived, because passports are made of magical paper with mystical ink that just never get destroyed. Then also people found passports on the sidewalk in New York City between the plane hitting the building and the building collapsing. They found passports, only of the hijacker, by the way. They didn't find passports of other people, just to hide, which is, man, it's just another coincidence. What are we talking about here? Makes perfect sense. And they were then handed to the New York City Police Department. So I could go on and on and on. I told you I have thousands of hours in 9/11 research. And another one that's fairly big is I literally went through all the records of the FAA and the Social Security Death Index. Okay, so those were two important things to look at. So when I looked at the FAA records, which to the best of my recollection aren't available any longer, the FAA is the agency that has everything to do with airspace, flying, commercial air traffic, anything and everything with that. They have to record every flight that is scheduled. They have to record when is that flight scheduled for, where is it flying from, where is it flying to. Then they have to record the actual takeoff time. We all know flights get delayed. So there's a scheduled time, there's a takeoff time, how much time in the air, what's the landing time. Now that's recorded automatically for every single flight anywhere in the United States. The recorded takeoff time, and I have hard copies of these records. I have to find them, but I have them. The recorded time of takeoff for all 4 flights. When I checked the databases, the official .gov databases was 0000. It's in military time. So 0000, that was the recorded time for all takeoffs. So according to the FAA official flight tracking data, the flights never took off. Why? Why would the FAA have a record of those flights never taking off? What's the Social Security Death Index? The Social Security Death Index is an official database where everybody that has a Social Security number in the United States and dies gets recorded in, and I think it usually happens within 3 to 6 months. At the, that's the longest it takes. So it was later said that most of the people that weren't foreigners, of course, were found in the Social Security Death Index within a year. That's not true. I was going through that index a few years after 9/11, at least 2 or 3 years after 9/11, and I typed in every single name of the official list that I could find of the victims of 9/11 that should have been reported in the Social Security Death Index, and I could find only a very small percentage. Don't quote me on it, but it was maybe 13 or 14% of all the victims that supposedly died that day that I could find in the Social Security Death Index. What that means, I don't know. Then there are multiple reports by high-level military people and other high-level people that report on what happened to those alleged flights, which never took off. Image and video analysis of the planes hitting the Twin Towers, for all intents and purposes, would suggest that those weren't actually planes, that we might have seen something like a early version of CGI AI technology. It was clearly available. I mean, they were doing movies back then that were highly realistic, so it was available. Think of The Matrix. The Matrix was released in 1999. Think of all the action scenes that were in there, and you could do it. So it's inconclusive whether planes were hitting the buildings or something else. But I'm leaning towards something else for 9/11. So now, like I said, we could go on and on and on about the coincidences, but I want to close this with something that I think we can take away that is more important than all of these things together. 9/11 has triggered the birth of what has become the alternative media. There was an alternative media before then, and it wasn't bad at all. It was just very small. But 9/11 was the trigger event. It was it was what opened so many eyes and continues to. And people went on to become authors and started websites with video. That was way before YouTube and all of that. And the branching off of a completely new dimension began. Like, this awakening thing really hit after 9/11 in a big way. I'm not saying it was perfect. I'm not saying it wasn't disturbed. And it wasn't until the year 2020, which was the sequel to 9/11, really, that was the real sequel. It wasn't the other stuff that happened in between. It was just, that was the sequel. That was the next really massive worldwide psyop like we've never seen it. That one was the complete hijacking of the alternative media. So in those 19 years, believe it or not, yes, there were hijacking. Yes, there were operatives involved, but it was a fairly good and independent field. And only now in recent months is there sort of really an emergence, a few years, of authentic people that stay authentic and are not part of the hijack of the alternative media. I think that the Matrix was changed that day so fast. And I'm starting to believe that on the highest plane, this will be ultimately more beneficial than detrimental. We all know that 9/11 was used to pass the Patriot Act. It was used to codify and legalize complete totalitarian surveillance. It helped usher in the cell phone era in the United States. It helped usher in the acceptance of airport control and scanners, pat downs, being treated like cattle. That's what all it ushered all that in. It ushered in wars. It ushered in a complete change in governance and politics. Yes, I know all of that, and we all see the detrimental effects of that. But the awakening that it ushered in, I think, is even more impactful and ultimately will be more important than all of these other things. And this is the key takeaway that I want to share, and I share it every year, is in honoring those who gave their lives that day, and there were many people who lost their lives that day. Honoring those, we don't do that by building some memorial sites or regurgitating the same old lie. We do that by furthering this awakening within ourselves and around us, and committing and being faithful to the truth, no matter how inconvenient it is in the moment. Because we have now 9/11s happen all the time, if you will. The scale and the sheer magnitude and the frequency, volume of events of such big caliber have become, much more prevalent in recent years. And we must more than ever commit to the truth, not to be fearful, not to be alarmists, but because the truth always sets you free. So to me, I still believe that the day will come where actually justice will be done around 9/11, because there has been none, just like always. These events get discussed. I mean, documentaries, movies, films, commissions, promises by presidential candidates and whatnot, that all get forgotten, because who was charged for 9/11? Islamic terrorists that sit in Gitmo? Yeah, okay. And we all know they weren't the ones pulling it off, right? They weren't the ones planning it. They weren't the ones financing it. They weren't the ones. So where are these folks? As always, justice hasn't been delivered on a visible level. But in the invisible field, it's inevitable. In the invisible field, the triumph of truth is inevitable. But it can only happen when we're all committed to it and we continue to be committed to it. And so, that's how I honor the folks that were killed that day, and also the folks who stepped up and spoke the truth and were killed later on. All the firefighters, the police officers that died, the witnesses. There's a lot of witnesses that died after 9/11. Interestingly, they just all had heart attacks, car accidents, stumbled and fell in front of the train and stuff like that. So that's how we can honor them. And when they say never forget, I agree with that, but never forget the truth. Always remember the truth, not the bullshit story. So when in the following days you will hear all these things, and when people talk to you about it, and when they talk about remembering what happened that day, don't be shy. It's not like you need to scream it at them, but don't be shy to tell the truth. It's like, we've never been told what happened that day. People have researched, people have spoken up, people have explored this, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people. But officially, by the media, by the government, by reports, we were never told the truth. So all that we know is the propaganda that came out. The last thing I will say is that it caused a wave of patriotism and unity, right? And many times people cite that as a positive, and I could absolutely agree with that. But the unity and the truth were based on a shared trauma, on a shared shock. They weren't based on the truth. And this is something that we also need to remember. Had people known the truth, they would have also united, but their attention and anger would have gone in a completely different direction, much, much closer to home, right? So, there's a lot still to be talked about here. And someday, this will turn out to be the day that broke the camel's back, the straw that broke the camel's back, in a good way. Also, we would love to invite you. We have started a new journey out here on the farm, on the homestead. We have goats, we have chickens. We're exploring all of that, and we are creating new memories and building this whole life here. And Christine had a wonderful idea to invite our precious and beautiful extended family in. So we're doing a show called Farm Tales in our subscriber community on Locals. And that's where we kind of show what we do and the funny stuff the goats do. Like this morning, they climbed on trees, which, it's funny to watch. And it was the first day that the chickens went out to the pasture. They're still a little, not quite sure about it yet. But all those things and more, and our thoughts and what's happening here, we share there. So if that's interesting to you, join us on. Yeah, it's a little more private. It's a little more behind the scenes kind of deal. Inspired.locals.com. We would absolutely love to see you there. So, my friends, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for being here with us. We love you. We appreciate you. And we will be back with you again very, very soon. Christine and I would love to invite you into something really special. We started a new show on Locals called Farm Tales, where we share the real stories from our homestead, the animals, the garden, the beauty, and even the funny mishaps along the way. Just like all of our work, it's about living consciously in harmony with nature and creating a life of true freedom. Please click the link down below and join us for Farm Tales on Locals. We would love to see you there.